that may be their local child welfare offices, but certainly every daycare, child care provider should have a number, know the number to call, so indeed they can make that report of suspicion.
Doctor, doesn't the law require providers to report child abuse?
Oh yes, it does, but I want to stress that it's what you're reporting is a suspicion of child abuse. And I think a lot of people become confused with that term, and I think that can be intimidating to a lot of folks because they say, gee, I'm not sure I know what it is, or do I have to prove it, and do I have to investigate it? And I think the important thing is just to recognize that the way the statute is written, and in most states, and certainly in Oklahoma, it's the suspicion of abuse and neglect. And if you, in your job, profession, as a child care provider, if you have a reasonable suspicion of abuse or neglect, then the law requires you to report that suspicion. And it's also important to recognize that the law doesn't require you to have to show it. The law, you have satisfied the legal requirements if you've just reported that suspicion. Then that suspicion is reported to child welfare. Child welfare is expected to investigate, and the results of that investigation is made available to the district attorney's office. Now, in many states and many arenas, if this suspicion comes out of a daycare center, then usually that state's agency relating to licensing of daycare or child care providers is involved in the investigation. But I think that should make it an easy process for any person to do. Is you pick up the phone and say, gee, I'm concerned.
So it's really the reporting of the suspicion that's the important thing.
Oh, absolutely. And all you're going to be asked is, gee, why are you concerned? And it's perfectly all right to be concerned. In fact, we want that. And the law recognizes also that sometimes you'll have concerns that it really is an abuse. And that's also okay, because you'll never get into trouble for reporting a suspicion of abuse, even if you're wrong. And that was recognized up front when the reporting legislation was passed. Yes, there's going to be erroneous reports.
Right.
And that's perfectly okay. And because the whole purpose is to protect the child and to provide services to families. And so the child care provider has no responsibility in investigating. It's just a matter of reporting a suspicion, and the law protects you from any retribution by virtue of making that report, even if you're wrong.
Most injuries caused by child abuse are pretty easy to spot: bruises, burns, broken bones, and so forth. But I'd like to talk for just a minute about something that may not show outward symptoms, and that's shaken baby syndrome. Now, could you please tell us a little bit about what shaken baby syndrome is and how those injuries are caused?
Oh, you bet. Unfortunately, it's more common than many people think, and it's a major cause of death and morbidity in children, particularly under 2.5 years of age. We see approximately 1 to 2 such children a month in this very emergency department, and not infrequently these children may be brought in from child care facilities. And the cause is almost universal. A principal caretaker losing control with the child. They've had it. They become very frustrated. Usually the child's crying, gets on their nerves. They may be under stress from other things, and then they just lose it with the child. And they grab the child, usually by the chest or around the arms, and violently shake the child. And I have to stress that it's a very violent shaking. We're not talking about playful shaking with a baby, which, while we may not advise it, we have no evidence that that causes harm. This is a very violent act, and the extent of the violence is such that even were a layperson happened to walk by and observe this while it was in progress, they would, not knowing anything about it, would immediately recognize that this was a very violent act, that this child was being truly assaulted. And so they lose control, and it's usually because of the baby's crying that just gets on the nerves, and they've had it. Sometimes they're not even aware of how much they've lost control with their baby at that point in time. During early development, a baby's head is relatively heavy and the neck muscles are weak. The brain and the connecting tissue are very fragile. That's soft. And I've often used the analogy of a developing baby's brain being like Jell-O. And when the Jell-O is shaken, little slits and tears can occur in the Jell-O. This makes the brain very likely to be severely injured if the baby is shaken. When a baby's head is shaken, the force of the brain moving back and forth, or a sudden impact from being thrown or dropped, may cause the delicate blood vessels between the skull and the brain to tear. This bleeding may occur inside and outside the sections of the brain. This, of course, can result in severe brain damage or even death. If death is avoided, the brain damage may prevent the baby from seeing or walking or talking for the rest of their life. Even the slightest injury can cause permanent brain damage and physical impairment that may not become apparent till later on in life. It only takes one time or just a few seconds to hurt a baby for the rest of its life.
It sounds like these injuries are happening too frequently. Who's responsible?
Well, the principal caretaker, or what we call the primary caretaker, usually mom or dad, or is not uncommon, mom and boyfriend. One of those two tends to be the primary perpetrator most of the time. Certainly it can happen in other places. Anyone that takes care of a child, particularly if they're under stress and have a short fuse and a short temper, can lose it, so to speak. But the most common is either the parents, or a common factor is the mom's boyfriend, not infrequently.
So what are some of the signs or symptoms that a child care provider might look for?
Well, it's an excellent question, because sometimes it can be very hard to recognize, or it may not be recognizable at all. But usually it may present with the child being incredibly irritable or fretful, and the child really being almost unable to be consoled. On the other hand, and the child may be eating poorly, and the child care provider can simply note a drastic change in the way the baby acts. If the child care provider really knows their baby, then when the child comes in and is a marked change of behavior, obviously they can be concerned about it. The findings that may present even more dramatically. The child may have an episode of not breathing. We call it apnea episodes. The child may turn blue, which we call cyanosis. The child may have a seizure. And this type of activity or symptomatology or symptoms might result in the child care provider calling an ambulance or calling help in that sense. So the symptoms can be very subtle. Sometimes the child just appears ill, throwing up, vomiting. A lot of times the child may have a bulging soft spot, a bulging fontanelle, if the baby is less than 9 or 10 months of age and the fontanelle hasn't closed. So that there can be really a wide variation of symptoms, and some of the symptoms may be just simply those symptoms of what you would otherwise suspect to be a sick child, in which case then the child care provider's concern about that would be expressed to the parents or that sort of thing.
Doctor, you've covered a wide range of symptoms here, but they don't all mean that shaken baby syndrome has occurred, do they?
Oh gosh, no, and obviously that can be difficult. The main thing is that the child care provider knows their child, knows their baby, and because other illnesses can have the same symptoms. It